Hello friends, in this video we are going to implement user login functionality in Friends Forever. In the previous videos we had completed register functionality where we have registered the user to Friends Forever. In this video we would ask user to enter their credentials and access the Friends Forever application. So when the user is successfully authenticated to the application, the user would be redirected to a landing page, that is the user home page. So this is what we are going to implement here. So currently the application looks like this. So there's nothing on the logon page, and we have a register page which we have implemented till now, and this link would redirect us to the logon page. And at the end of this video we would have a logon page looking like this. So basically we have to implement form controls on the logon view. Then we have to post user request with credentials to the controller. Then we would basically validate those credentials against the database. If the credentials are correct, then we will redirect the user to the landing page. Otherwise, user will be shown with the error messages. So this is the entire flow plus the UI of the logon form we are going to implement in this video. So let's go to our project. So this is our Friends Forever project, and I'm going to implement this login functionality in three parts. So the first part would be implementing the landing page where the user would be redirected to once he is successfully authenticated. In the second part, we would implement controls on the view, posting the form to the controller and validating the details against the database. So that would form the second part. And the third part would be designing and improving the UI of logon form. So let's start with the first part, and we are going to create a landing page, and that landing page would be the home page for the logged in user. In order to create that, I'm going to add a new controller, that is home controller, which would deals with all the requests related to home page. So I'm going to add a MVC5 empty controller. I'm going to name that as home controller. This home controller will have a action result method with name home page, and we will add a view as well, which would refer layout.cshtml. Okay, and let me build this application. Go to my browser and try to access this page through URL. So you could see I'm redirected to home page while accessing through URL, but this should not be the ideal case because this is the home page of the user, and in order to access this page, user has to be authenticated to the application. But currently this page is accessible anonymously. Any user can access this without authenticating to the application. So we have to prevent that, and in order to prevent that and implement authorization or authentication, we have to use authorize attribute on home controller. So now if user tries to access any action result method of this controller, the application would check if the user is authenticated or not. Only if it is authenticated and authorized to access that action result method, then the user would go ahead. Otherwise, an unauthorized access exception would be thrown. Now if I build my application again and refresh this page, let's see what happens. So now I'm getting HTTP error 401 unauthorized. So this is basically saying that you're trying to access a part of application which requires you to be authenticated or authorized to the application. Without that, you cannot access this. So this is how you implement authorization and authentication in your application by using authorize attribute. Now, in the real scenario, you don't want this exception page shown to the user. Instead of that, you want user to be redirected to login page so that user can log into the application. So that configuration can be done in web config. So I'll go to my web config. Under system.web element, I'll specify authentication and then set its mode to forms authentication. So we are going to use forms authentication, and then I'll create another element that is forms, I'll set its login URL to /security/logon, and I'll set timeout to default value. Now what happens when user gets 401 exception, user would be redirected to this URL, and this URL is basically security logon, which is our logon page. So let me build the application. Okay, now if I try to refresh this page, instead of showing that exception, I have been redirected to logon with a return URL. So now if I enter my credentials on the form and I'm successfully authenticated, I'll be redirected to homepage. Now let me go to my register page. Okay, and let me try to access homepage. You could see I have been redirected to the logon page. So this is what we want to happen. So we are done with our first part, that is creating and configuring our landing page. Now let's go for the second part, that is creating a form on the view and posting credentials to the server side and validating data against the database. So currently logon.cs HTML has a single header tag, so we'll be getting rid of this. Now in order to render the controls, we are going to create a new view model, which the same way we created for register functionality, and in this case we are going to create logon view model class, and this class would have two properties. The first would be username, and second would be password. So we want only two controls on our view, username and password, and that's it. And I want both the properties to be required, so user has to provide value for both the controls. So this is what data annotation attributes are. So we are implementing validations as well. Now in order to make this view strongly typed, I have to refer that view model on my view using model keyword, and then I will basically refer that view model. Now I can use lambda expression on my view. So first thing I'm going to have is a div, and then I'll create a form using html.beginForm helper. Okay, and inside this form I'm going to have a tabular structure. So I've already created that structure. I'll just copy paste that. And inside this tabular structure I have label for and text box for username, and similarly label for and password for our password property. Then I'm going to have two buttons, that is submit and reset. Okay, and this is our basic HTML. So if I go to the view, refresh the page, you would see a simple form. Okay, there is some exception here. Okay, basically I have not built my application, so let me build the application and refresh the page. You'll see a form being rendered on the UI. Okay, now I want this form to be submitted to server side when I click on this submit button, that is login button. So for that, I'll go to my security controller, and just below our logon action result method, which renders the logon page, I'll have another action method with the same name but with HTTP post attribute, and I'll be accepting object of type logon view model. So model binding would trigger and will fill the properties inside this with the form post data. And inside this we are going to implement our logic. So we are going to do the same what we've done in our register view. So we are going to check if model state is valid, then we would do our validation stuff, whether the user is valid user by validating against the database. If user is not valid, then we would return the model with the model errors. Okay, and now in order to validate the credentials against the database, we need to have a method in our service. So we'll utilize the same security service. So we are going to have a method in the security service which would return a boolean value true or false, and this method would be is valid user. This method would accept parameter of type logon view model. So the user's username and password we are going to send to this function, and in this function I'm going to have object of type user details. Okay, and then I'm going to access I'm going to get that user from the database using context. I'll be accessing user details db set, and then I will use single or default link you function. I'll compare database email property with model's username property, plus I also want its password to be same, so I will compare password with the model password. If both the details are matching with any record in the database, then the user would be returned here. And then finally I can check if user is null, then that means there is no user in the database. I'll be returning false. Else, that means there is a user in the database, then I'll be returning true. So this is a simple function which would return true or false based on user is present in the database or not. And then I'll refer include this function in our security service interface. Okay, now going back to our security controller, we'll check if underscore service dot is valid user. So we'll pass the model, and if it is valid, then we will go inside this if block, and then we will basically redirecting the user to action method, which is our home page, which is our landing page, and second parameter would be the controller name, so controller name is home. So this if condition basically says that if user is valid, so this function would return true, that means it's valid, then redirect the user to home page. Otherwise what we will do is, otherwise we will add a error to model state. Okay, the first parameter it utilizes or accepts is sync key, so key would be empty, and exception would be invalid username or password. So that means there is no user with such username and password combination. So this is all we have to implement in our logon function where the form is posted. So let's attach a debugger and run the application and see how it works. So currently in the database I have a single user registered, so I'll be trying to use the same user to access the application. So I'll specify my username and password. Okay, and for now I will enter a wrong password and try to log in. So in this case my user will be invalid, and I'll be going to else block, and it will add a model error, and this model error would be returned on the UI. Okay, so currently we are not returning anything from here, or let me go to the logon.cshtml. So basically we are returning the view, but we are not capturing the errors. So let me add a div here, and we'll add html.validation summary. So this would basically capture all our error messages. So let me add wrong password again and click on login. So what will happen, this would add model error, and then this model would be returned back. So you would see that message invalid username or password, and if I try to post the form without entering any detail, then this would say that both the fields are required. Now let me try to log in through correct details and click on login. In this case our user would be valid, and then the user would be redirected to home page. but it doesn't happen. I am again redirected back to log on. This is because we have validated whether the user is valid user or not, but we have not set this user to be authenticated to the application. Okay, the application still doesn't know whether the user is authenticated or not. So that is done using forms authentication class. Okay, so you have to basically include this namespace and set a authorization cookie, and you have to pass the username. So username is present in our model, that is model.username. The second parameter is whether you want to create a persistent cookie, you just have to pass false. Now I'll be successfully redirected back to that page. So I've built my application and I'll try to log into the application. Okay, so I'll specify the same user. I'll specify the password as well. Click on login, then I'll be redirected to the home page. So you could see now the user credentials are validated against database. User is a valid user and he's been redirected to home page. So this is the second part we have done, that is posting the data to the controller, validating against database, and redirecting the user to the landing page. Now comes the last part, that is basically working on the UI. So in order to work on the UI, the first thing I'm going to do is basically include an image which we require on our logon view. So I will include that image in our images folder. So that's an existing item and this is the image. Now I will go to my logon.cshtml, and at the top of the form I want a logo. So I'll just have a div and just drag and drop this image here and set its alt attribute to ff logo, the same way we had it in our register view. So if I go back to the logon page, click refresh, you'll see that logo at the top. Then I want to have a field set around this form, so we'll create a field set. Okay, and I'll place that field set around this form. I want this field set to be 300 pixel wide. Okay, and then inside this field set I'm going to have a legend which would form the title, and that would be login form, and this is the field set and legend. And then finally I'll have a action link which would redirect us to register. Okay, and let me have a text like sign up, and the action method is register. Okay, so if I go to the UI, refresh it, you could see the form is enclosed inside the field set. We have a top logo, we have a bottom link. Now we want this arrangement to be center. So similar to what we've done in the register, we'll have a main div. We'll enclose all these divs inside that div, and we'll try to move our main div to the center. So we'll just set its style to margin left 500 pixel, and then have the last div margin left 130 pixels, so that that link looks center towards the form. If I refresh it, you could see the link is center to the form and the form is center to the page. Now comes the last part where we have to show the background image. So for that I have a class created, and that class is body logon. So I just have to include this class in my site.css, and I have to make sure this site.css is referred on my layout page and my logon page is referring to that layout page. And then I'll use this class on my logon page. Before that, I'll replace this div with the body and set the class attribute of this body. Now if I go to my UI, I'll be able to see that background image getting rendered. Now I have two more styles for field set and legend specifically. So this would basically improve the style for field set and legend. So I'll just include them in my site.css and refresh the page. So you would see the border is pretty much thin compared to thick border previously, and our login page looks completely what we have set as a target. And just that instead of redirect to register, we've had a login or a link text as sign up. So this is how you can implement. And if I try to log in again, I'll be redirected to homepage. So this is how you can implement login functionality in your application, and by this way you can authenticate to an application and user would be redirected to the homepage. In the next video we would basically work on the homepage to make it look better. I hope you like this video. Thank you friends.